Welcome to All Things Seniors, a podcast for caregivers. If you are a caregiver or someone who is looking to learn about challenges and solutions pertaining to seniors, you are at the right place. We created this podcast to support all caregivers so that while you are driving, cooking, or working out, you can listen to those episodes from this podcast which pertains to your needs the most. In each episode, we will have an industry expert who will share their wisdom and knowledge with you to help you better serve your loved ones. So let's dive right into All Things Seniors.
Hello and welcome to All Things Seniors. Did you know that cohousing originated in Denmark back in 1960s? And today some 50,000 people in Denmark live in cohousing. Although in Canada, we have less than 20 cohousing projects, mainly in BC, but there are over 150 such projects in US and maybe more now. Building communities and avoiding loneliness is something as a society we all need to do, and cohousing definitely helps. And we are glad that today we have Grace Kim, who is an architect for over 20 years experience. And she is internationally recognized expert in cohousing and the art and craft of creating communities. She has a great TED Talk, which I encourage everyone to go and watch as well. Some great content there. Grace, welcome to our episode.
Hi, thank you.
Grace, tell me, for our listeners, what is cohousing?
So cohousing is an intentional neighborhood where people know each other and look after one another. Cohousing, everybody has their own private home, but they also share a significant amount of community common spaces together, whether they be indoors or outdoors.
So how it is different than a condominium place where everybody has their own, for example, small suite, and they also have a social hall. How co-housing is different than condominium blocks?
Yeah, that's a good question. So co-housing is different than a traditional condominium or single family home development in that there is a very strong intention for the neighborhood connection. So unlike a typical condominium complex where people buy in, their motivation might be proximity to their workplace or as a real estate investment or as their starter home. There's different motivations for why people buy into a condominium or even a single family home. But in co-housing, the primary intention is to build community connections. And so the fact that they're buying a home that's a condominium or a single family house or a townhouse is sort of secondary to that primary interest of building community.
And because of a different motive, do you also see different outcomes and different results in their lifestyle?
Yes. I would say because of the intention being the driving force for why people join cohousing, there are a lot of benefits that the residents have in their personal lives. So some of those benefits are just really practical things, like if you need to borrow a cup of sugar, you have somebody that you can count on. 30 families, somebody will have something for you to borrow, whether it's sugar or a blender or a power tool or a sleeping bag, whatever you need. There's lots of stories of people being able to just run to the grocery store, even if they have like a toddler who's home taking a nap. They still run to the grocery store because they can ask a neighbor to just, come over for a couple hours and make sure that if they wake up or, to look after them. There's lots of ways that neighbors in cohousing help each other in very informal and sort of spontaneous ways.
This is phenomenal. All of a sudden, there is a new image for co-housing because you mentioned that maybe toddlers are also living there, and we don't see toddlers in long-term care facilities. So is that a big difference between the two setups?
Yeah, I would say that co-housing tends to be multi-generational. There are, I would say, a handful, maybe two handfuls, of senior co-housing communities where it's age-restricted 55 and older. But I would say there are lots of seniors who live in co-housing in multi-generational settings by choice. And it's interesting. I've heard from both camps. So I hear from some of the folks that live in co-housing that while they love their grandchildren, they don't really, love other people's grandchildren, right? So some people choose senior co-housing because being around children all the time is too much. It's too loud, it's too much activity, it's too messy, whatever, right? And on the flip side, like I think about my own community where I live, the seniors that live there are very intentional about wanting to be in a multi-generational setting because they don't want to be with a bunch of old people. And that's, I'm quoting them specifically, that they appreciate seeing the little ones. Like we literally had a baby born the month after we moved in. So we've watched this little boy grow up in front of our eyes. And to remember the joy of seeing the world for the first time through a child's eyes, for those of us that are parents, seeing that again is amazing. For some of the seniors, they never had their own children, so they never got to experience that. So being able to be part of that process has been very rich for them, and also for them to be grandparents when they don't, either they don't have their own grandchildren or their grandchildren live far away. There's an opportunity to serve as a grandparent or an elder to a child that is very immediate and close in their lives.
These are great benefits. So why don't we see more of co-housing option in North America?
I guess I can think of a couple of reasons. One is I think the North American idea of sort of our rugged individualism, right? We're a continent of immigrants. And so I think as we have come here over the hundreds of years, people got into this idea of, oh, we can make it ourselves. We've left whatever situation was back in our home country, and now we're here to prove ourselves as our own, and we're going to make it on our own. And when I think about what co-housing is, it's really no different than what the multi-generational family situations you might find in Asian cultures or in South American cultures or in African cultures, where there is a very strong sense of tribe or family or community. And it's really a North American phenomenon that we've done a good job of exporting to the rest of the world, right? Of being an independent nuclear family, and you just worry about and sustain yourselves. And that's caused a lot of isolation and insularity. And so I think a big challenge we have is just overcoming that, right? But I think the other piece is that there's also a connection of home ownership or occupation of your home as a financial investment, a real estate transaction, which again is also a very North American thing. It's very common in other countries, especially European countries, where this model, where co-housing came from. Rental tenureship, I guess, in a home is something that is very happens all the time, and the majority of people live their whole lives in that situation where they're a renter as opposed to a homeowner. And so I think when those two things collide with co-housing, oftentimes I'm surprised when I meet people that are in an early stage of co-housing development that they're trying to sell homes rather than recruiting people with this idea of building community. And likewise, the people that are trying to approach co-housing, whether it's an existing community or a forming community, they want to see what their house is going to look like and what the cost is, and they're comparing it to the market. And so sometimes that becomes a stumbling block, especially for people who aren't as open-minded or progressive. They might think, oh, that's a bunch of people telling me what to do or telling me, how I should live, and I don't want that. Rather than thinking more holistically about, like, where am I in my life stage and what help do I need or could I offer, and how might my life be more rich by doing that?
This is great information, and I think that listeners now can make sense that if they see themselves or their parents, and if the expectation of the parents is to live in a place which is more socially engaging, where they'll be interacting with other families or residents of that community, in that case, co-housing could be a good solution for them. Tell me, what do you think is the biggest reason why people don't opt for it, other than the reason you mentioned about the house pricing? Like, sometimes do you find that people say, oh, you know what, sometimes it becomes very intrusive and I don't get my privacy? Is that the reason as well?
No, I would say privacy is actually not an issue in co-housing. You can have as much privacy as you want because you have your own home and you can just close your door. I think that maybe a deterrent that some people might see for family members that they're thinking about for co-housing is that there is an expectation, because you're in an intentional community, that you participate, right? So the participation in every community is different. It could be participating in a meal program. Like, it's pretty typical in co-housing to have a community meal 1 to 5 times a week. Or a participation might be in that there's a monthly work party where, people are collectively taking care of the landscaping together, or collectively building something on the property, or collectively cleaning up the common house or something. So, and every community has a different expectation for how much work. So that might be something that if somebody is thinking about co-housing for the family member, they might be like, oh, I don't know if my parent would be interested in cooking with other people, or my parent is a terrible cook and they're not going to want to cook, or my parent doesn't have enough physical strength or skills that are handy, or, whatever. But I think if somebody does the research and actually starts to talk with different communities, the interesting thing about co-housing is that there's a role for everybody and there's a job for everybody. And so I think about in my community, there's one of our best friends actually moved in. And before we moved in, we used to do a Monday night dinner together. And when it was his turn to cook, he cooked the same thing every time. And it was, he didn't cook very often because it was usually when his wife was out of town. That wasn't his thing. So I would have never said before that, he loves to cook. But now that he's in community and he has to lead once every 6 weeks a meal, he does the most elaborate meal. He will go all out and make fresh bread and do a dessert and a signature cocktail, to the point where some of his family members who come and visit, they're like, wow, or is this really my son-in-law? Comments like that. So I think there's lots of preconceptions people might have about their family member, about their willingness or ability to participate. Yet there's jobs for everyone and room for everyone to stretch and grow in ways that they might not have if they just lived in their single family house.
So in a way, what you're saying is that people sometimes find a different side of their personality, which they did not explore before, right? That's awesome. Grace, tell us how it affects the depression, because we know that when people get retired or start to live by themselves as empty nesters and the kids have moved out, they sometimes get into the depression, or rather I should say depression creeps up, as to how co-housing helps them to live more happily, if that's the right word.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Susan Pinker is a researcher that did a TED Talk also in 2017. And she has a slide that I'm trying to recall, but there were some behaviors that would demonstrate sort of longevity in life. And the top 2 things, and there were things on the list like, if you reduce smoking, or, stop drinking, or exercise more, these things would improve your chances for living longer. And the 2 things that were at the top of her list of 10 items was having strong social connections and strong relationships. And those were the 2 most important things that would help longevity of life. And this is information based on a study that Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstedt from Brigham Young University published in 2015. Basically, I would say loneliness and social isolation is a function of people being isolated. It doesn't mean that there's not people around, but just not being connected to the people around you. And so the nice thing about co-housing is that you can have as much access to community and interaction as you want. It's literally outside your door. And I've had people ask me, oh, well, that's probably good for extroverts or people who are really social, but it's actually really great for introverts and people that are not likely to reach out, because you're in a space together that you have familiarity with and that you have consistent contact with people, that it doesn't feel like a big, emotional or psychological chore to go to a community dinner, because it's a regular thing, right? And people know that you might be more introverted. So you don't have to worry about making small talk or chit chat. That's what makes, introverts really anxious. That's the big benefit, is co-housing prohibits you from getting lonely. I mean, if somebody didn't show up for 2 or 3 times, people would start to show up at the door and say, hey, is everything okay? Just want to check in on you. Or even at the meal, has anyone seen so-and-so? I haven't seen them all day. I wonder why they're not at the meal. And it's not in an intrusive way, but it's in a way that is, like I said at the beginning, about looking after one another and caring for one another, making sure nobody is lost in the busyness of everyone's lives.
I'm so happy that the way you phrased it, that it is primarily not only about for somebody who's an extrovert. And, I would have thought that. But the way you said it, it is actually more beneficial for people who could be an introvert personality. And now maybe it's up to the family members who are listening to this to say, hey, I know my mom and dad, and they tend to be showing the traits and characteristics of an introvert person. If they live by themselves, maybe they choose not to make those phone calls or choose not to go out. Having them in a co-housing facility will be beneficial for their health and to avoid depression. This is awesome, and I hope that people take away this message. So thanks for sharing this. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe and review it on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the show. This way, you never miss an episode. Also, check out show notes, where we will put a lot of the things that Grace shared with us today. And, we will identify those links from Google, and, we will share it with you over there. Also, we will have some behind the scene pictures for you on our Facebook page, All Things Senior. So definitely check that out. Again, thank you, Grace, for your time today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thanks for listening, you all. I'm your host, Rafiq Punjani, and we will be back next week. Until then, ciao.